Across 4 years of the bloodiest war this country has ever fought, the Confederate soldier did not break. He marched barefoot through the snow at Fredericksburg. He held the line at the bloody angle at Spotsylvania when any sensible man would have run. He survived on handfuls of parched corn and the promise of a nation that was supposed to exist. What broke him wasn't the Union Army. It was a letter from home. By 1864, soldiers across the Confederate lines were receiving the same letter in different handwriting. The children are hungry. The money you sent won't buy flour anymore. Come home. And they did. By the tens of thousands. Not defeated, pulled home by a government that had already failed them. We are dying of a theory. A Confederate officer wrote that in 1864. He wasn't talking about Union artillery. He was talking about the very idea the Confederacy was built on, that 13 fiercely independent states could fight a modern industrial war without surrendering an inch of their independence. They couldn't. This is the story of how the Confederacy destroyed itself before the Union ever got the chance. Jefferson Davis was the wrong man for an impossible job. He was an administrator by instinct, meticulous, legalistic, a man who believed a properly filed report could solve any problem. What the Confederacy needed was a politician who could coax, threaten, and seduce 13 governors into surrendering their precious sovereignty for the sake of survival. Davis couldn't do it. It wasn't in his character. The problem, as Davis saw it, was that he was leading a rebellion against centralized authority that now required centralized authority to survive. Every time he asked a governor for troops, for supplies, for the right to impress a railroad, he was asking them to betray the very principle they'd seceded to protect. They said no, again and again. What Davis understood, too late and never forcefully enough, was that a confederation of sovereign states is not a nation. It's an argument waiting to happen. And arguments don't win wars. The Confederacy was born with a fatal contradiction lodged in its heart. It just took 4 years to bleed out. Here is what happens when a government built on a theory runs out of actual money. The Confederacy had bet everything on cotton. King Cotton would force Britain and France to intervene. King Cotton would finance the war. King Cotton, it turned out, was worthless once the Union Navy parked itself outside every southern port. So Richmond did what dying governments always do. It printed. By 1863, the Confederate dollar was losing value so fast that prices changed between breakfast and dinner. A barrel of flour that cost $6 in 1861 cost $1,000 by the end of the war. 1,000. This was not an economic statistic. This was a family in Georgia opening a letter from their husband at the front and realizing the money inside couldn't buy a loaf of bread. This was a mother in South Carolina feeding her children boiled weeds and telling them it was soup. This was a soldier at Petersburg putting down his rifle because his children were starving and the government he was dying for had made his pay worthless. The Confederacy didn't lose these men to Union bullets. It lost them to its own printing press. When a soldier's family is hungry, the cause stops mattering. Survival is the only thing left. The problem was never a lack of courage at the front. The problem was that the front couldn't hold if the home couldn't eat. But the money was nothing compared to what was happening on the rails. The South had railroads, thousands of miles of them. What it didn't have was a railroad system. Different companies used different track gauges. A train that could run from Richmond to Danville couldn't run from Danville to Greensboro because the tracks literally didn't match. Goods had to be unloaded, carted across town, and reloaded onto a different train while Union locomotives moved troops and supplies on standardized lines with terrifying efficiency. Consider what this meant in practice. A wounded Confederate soldier being evacuated from Tennessee to a hospital in Georgia would be lifted off one train, carried through the streets on a stretcher, and loaded onto another, sometimes 2 or 3 times, because the rail companies couldn't agree on how wide their tracks should be. Men died in transit, not from their wounds, from the delay. Here is the image that should haunt you. In the winter of 1864, food was rotting in warehouses across Georgia and the Carolinas, while Lee's army was starving in the trenches at Petersburg, 150 miles apart. They had the food, they had the men, they couldn't connect them. The Confederate government knew the railroads needed to be seized and unified, but seizing private property meant overriding states' rights, and states' rights was the religion. You didn't touch the religion, even when men were dying because of it. What happened next made everything worse. The Confederacy asked poor men to die for rich men's institutions. The Twenty-Negro Law, passed in 1862, expanded in 1864, exempted any man who owned 20 or more enslaved people from military service. 20. If you owned 20 human beings, you didn't have to fight. If you owned none, and most Confederate soldiers owned none, you were conscripted until you died, or the war ended. The men who fought and died in Confederate gray were not, by and large, slaveholders. They were farmers, laborers, mechanics. And they noticed. They noticed that the wealthy planters who'd screamed loudest for secession were the ones staying home. They noticed their own families were starving while the planter class was protected. A rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. That wasn't Union propaganda. That was a phrase coined by Confederate soldiers themselves. It spread through the ranks like a disease. Men who had enlisted believing they were defending their homeland discovered they were defending a system designed to protect them least of all. By 1864, desertion wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. Thousands of men weren't just leaving the army, they were forming armed bands, raiding Confederate supply depots, and waging their own private war against the government that had abandoned them. In parts of North Carolina and Mississippi, Confederate deserters controlled entire counties. The Confederacy had to send troops to fight its own people. The Confederacy was now fighting two enemies, the Union Army and itself. Joseph E. Brown was the governor of Georgia. He believed in states' rights the way other men believed in God, and he spent more of the war fighting Jefferson Davis than he spent fighting the Union. When Richmond demanded Georgia's militia for the Confederate Army, Brown refused. When Richmond tried to seize railroads in Georgia, Brown blocked them. When Richmond needed to impress supplies, Brown called it tyranny. Tyranny from the government that was supposedly defending Southern liberty. Davis would send telegrams begging for troops. Brown would send telegrams back, lecturing Davis about constitutional limits. One exchange in 1864 stretched across 17 telegrams. 17, while Sherman's army was already inside Georgia. Davis pleaded for every available man. Brown responded with a legal brief. Meanwhile, Sherman was burning his way through Georgia, the very state Brown was supposedly protecting. The governor was so consumed with limiting Richmond's power that he failed to defend his own capital. The end began not at Appomattox, but in the telegraph offices and governors' mansions, where the Confederacy's leaders refused to surrender their power to save their nation. They were so afraid of becoming the centralized tyranny they claimed to be fighting that they paralyzed their own war effort into extinction. That moment came not with a Union bayonet, but with a governor's refusal. The Confederacy did not lose the Civil War on a battlefield. It lost it in the printing presses that made money worthless. It lost it on the railroad lines that couldn't connect. It lost it in the governor's mansions where men chose ideology over survival. It lost it in the letters from home that pulled soldiers back to their children who hadn't eaten in days. By the time Lee walked into the McLean house at Appomattox, the Confederacy had already been dead for a year. The surrender just made it official. They built a nation to defend a way of life, then discovered the nation itself was incompatible with survival. The theory killed them, not the Union, not the generals, the theory. The sword didn't get knocked from their hand, it slipped from a grip that had already gone cold. If you want more stories like this, the ones that explain how wars are really won and lost, not on the battlefield, but in the decisions made far behind it, like and subscribe to this channel. We'll see you in the next one.